You're watching PM Agenda as we've been talking about the minimum wage decision today. Economic growth figures out as well, and the budget battle continues in Parliament. I'm pleased to welcome to the show the Shadow Assistant Treasurer Andrew Leigh and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer Steve Ciobo. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Good afternoon. Let's
start on the minimum wage. $18.70 it's going to go up for 1.5 million lowest paid. Unions say it's not enough. Business says it's too much. Does that mean it's the right balance, Andrew Leigh?
Well, I think it's an appropriate increase. We're talking about an increase, David, that's pretty much in line with inflation. The concern that I have is that the government's submission to the minimum wage talked about the benefits that would flow to minimum wage workers in the budget, didn't mention any of the budget nasties coming up. So I suspect many minimum wage workers will be welcoming this increase, but then also looking at the impact of GP taxes.
That'd be for a future minimum wage decision, wouldn't it, if and when those budget measures get through. But Steve Ciobo, do you think this is the right balance?
Well, look, I'm not obviously the industrial umpire. I don't make those decisions, but certainly I wouldn't begrudge anyone a pay rise. Obviously, the fundamental, inescapable fact, though, David, is that if you push wages up, there are fewer jobs in the economy.
Do you think this will do that in your electorate? Well, I mean, you've got a lot of small business there.
Look, the government's focus is upon creating the right business conditions for more people to be employed. I know that the hospitality industry in particular is really struggling at the moment. They are really struggling with penalty rates. They're struggling with the fact that there are massive increases in the cost of business. That's what they're saying to me. And I've seen, as anyone around Australia has seen, for example, we're now on public holidays. There are a lot of cafes and restaurants that used to be open on public holidays. They're now closed. And this was the pup that they were sold by the Labor Party. So fundamentally, we'll see in the fullness of time.
Let's talk about the economy then more broadly today. The GDP figures, growth figures, showed things are actually going pretty good, up 1.1% for the first 3 months of the year. Economic growth, 3.5% annually. Labor did complain a bit about the job losses that were announced during that period, but things have been ticking along all right.
David, I'll always welcome good economic news. I mean, fundamentally, we have to be in favour of a strong Australian economy, and so when good news comes in, I think that's terrific. There's clouds on the horizon in the consumer confidence numbers, which are tracking down badly, and in some of the business sentiment figures. And I think the challenge for the government will be to work through it. There's an interesting sort of partisan dimension to this. I'd be interested in Steve's view on this. The Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Confidence Survey has particularly tanked for Labor voters. It's almost as though coalition supporters are confident and still opening their wallets, but Labor voters are shutting theirs. And the problem for retailers is a dollar from a Labor voter is just as good as a dollar from the coalition voter, and if Labor voters close their wallets, that's an issue.
Fair enough, focusing on the confidence figures and what that might lead to, but what we know is those first few months of the year were pretty good, Steve Ciobo. Do we therefore need a tough, harsh budget like this one?
Well, we absolutely need a tough budget. I certainly don't agree that it's a harsh budget. It is a tough budget, David. And the reason we need it is because we were left with a situation where Labor was forcing Australia to borrow $1 billion a month just to repay the interest on the debt that Labor accumulated. Now, clearly structural savings need to be found. There needs to be change. There can't just be a continuation of status quo, because a continuation of status quo, as we know from MyInfo, would lead us to nearly $700 billion of debt.
These economic figures are good, you'll agree?
Absolutely.
And they're based, well, on very little change in economic policy settings since you took over. You haven't scrapped the carbon tax or the mining tax or these things that were meant to make a big difference. You haven't done that yet. So the economy is still ticking along all right.
Look, the economy is ticking along okay. From the government's perspective, David, the key point is this. We've never said, contrary to Labor's narrative, that we run around saying the sky's falling in. That's actually never been the case. Our consistent and clear point...
Well, you've said a wrecking ball through the economy.
Well, our consistent and clear point has been that in terms of the state of play that Labor left the budget in, it was the trajectory was going from bad to worse.
But has the carbon tax been a wrecking ball?
Well, it's clear that the carbon tax absolutely had a massive deflationary impact in terms of consumer confidence. And you saw that with the election of the coalition government last September, there was a very, very strong rebound in confidence and expectations.
Now, I know we're only just getting warmed up, but we've got to take an ad break, otherwise I'll get in trouble. But we're going to look more specifically at some of those budget measures. For our New Zealand viewers, though, New Zealand News is next for you. Luckily in Australia, you'll get to keep watching. Steve Ciobo and Andrew Leigh, stay with us. Welcome back to PM Agenda, and we're talking this afternoon to the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Andrew Leigh, and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo. Let's turn to the budget battle, which continues in Parliament today as well. And still Labor's focusing very heavily on the GP co-payment, the $7 fee that the government wants to introduce for visits to the doctor. Andrew Leigh, your name, of course, has been prominent in much of this debate, given what you've said previously. And to remind people what you've said, let me find it. The ideal model involves a small co-payment, not enough to put a dent in your weekly budget, but enough to make you think twice before you call the doc. So what do you really now think of this co-payment?
David, when I made those comments more than a decade ago while I was at university, I was wrong. Now I've listened to health experts and reached the view that the Australian Medical Association, the Medical Journal of Australia and many GPs in my electorate hold. But I think what's striking is that the Prime Minister and the Health Minister are far more concerned about what I said at university than what they said last year on the campaign trail. That tells you how unpopular this GP
That's not a bad point, Steve Ciobo, and it's not just last year even. I think it was earlier this year in the WA Senate re-election campaign where the suggestion of a co-payment to visit the GP was rubbished by the government as absolute nonsense.
Well, let's deal with what we've actually got, David. And what we actually have now is our proposal to do something to attempt to have people make a modest contribution towards the cost of visiting a GP. It's a principle that Labor apparently is railing against and up in arms about, and we've got Andrew here basically wanting to tear up his PhD.
But just quickly, you just said we should ignore the past and focus on what's on the table.
I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back 10 seconds if you permit me to go back 10 seconds. So that's what he just said. But the point is this, and that is with respect to the co-payment, that this is what needs to happen in order to make sure that the system is sustainable. And if we can have a modest co-payment in relation to pharmaceuticals, and Labor has no problem with it, then why can we not have a modest co-payment in relation to a GP visit and still have the doctors having the discretion as to whether or not they want to make that co-payment part of their service?
Another area, the pension, which your government wants to increase the pension access age to 70. Again, going back to something you said not a decade ago, but in 2009, you said in terms of life expectancy, 70 is the new 64. In terms of health, 74 is the new 64. With a steady decline in the share of back-breaking jobs and improvements in technology, it's reasonable to expect these numbers to keep rising. And you argued that we should have age indexation for the pension and for superannuation as well. Do you still hold that view?
Well, I think it was appropriate when Labor was in government and just put in place the largest increase in the pension in its 100-year history, that we also increased the access age for superannuation. We increased the age for accessing the pension.
You did argue specifically for 70 there.
I made a point about a health finding which had shown that life expectancy was improving. That's not news to anyone, David. Everyone's known that life expectancy is rising and the health of older Australians is getting better.
Yeah, but you specifically talk there about, I'm just wondering if you still stand by those comments about 70 being the new 64, talking about fewer back-breaking jobs, improvements in medical technology, and you said yet to look at many of the statutes on our book, you'd think none of these changes had ever occurred.
I'd certainly stand by the view that life expectancy's gone up, that older Australians are getting healthier and that there's fewer people in back-breaking jobs. But there are a lot of those back-breaking jobs around, David, and if you're talking about someone who's a checkout worker, a bricklayer, asking them to work 68, 69, 70, now with a lower pension, because the government will be indexing pensions to prices rather than wages, and that'll cost $80 a week over a 10-year period. This is a smaller pension at a later age.
Okay, but should we index, and the Commission of Audit said this as well, index the pension and superannuation access to life expectancy. So when it goes up, so does the pension age.
I think this is one of the most unfair things the government is doing in the budget.
You argued for that.
I've argued very strongly against that.
You said you argued that age indexation should apply to the pension and the superannuation access.
I think the increase that Labor put in place made sense, but I've certainly been on the record arguing that going to 70 is a mistake.
Right.
We know
and indexation's a mistake.
Well, there's two reasons why going to 70 is a mistake, and they are.
I'm just asking about indexation. Whether we should peg the pension age to life expectancy.
I think the increase that occurred under Labor, along with a big increase in the value of the pension, made sense.
Right.
But what the Coalition is doing is increasing the age and cutting the value. We know that poorer people die 6 years younger than affluent Australians.
You no longer believe in that indexation argument?
I think if you're doing it in the context of a big increase, then that's justifiable. If you're doing it in the context of a cut to pensions, it's simply not justifiable.
What do you think about this indexation argument that some have made in the past, including the Commission of Audit very recently?
Well, the government's policy is very straightforward, David. And I just heard Andrew turn around and say a cut in pensions, and we know that that's Labor's scare campaign. There is no cut in pension. The pension is not reducing. In fact,
going up at a lower rate.
The pension will keep increasing, and it will keep increasing twice a year, as it always has.
I think people appreciate, though, don't they?
Well, I don't,
it can either
actually.
go up this fast or this fast, and you're saying it should go up that fast. I mean, let's get real.
They're saying the pension is going up in line with inflation. That's right. And
It's
the
not
reason
as fast
why
as it otherwise would.
it's going up in a sustainable way, as opposed
At a
to
lower
Labor's.
rate. At a lower rate.
Well, it's going up in a sustainable fashion, as opposed to Labor's approach, which is completely unsustainable.
Why is it so hard to say, to drop the spin and say the pension is going to go up at a lower rate?
The pension is going up. Every 6 months,
Yes.
the pension will go up under the coalition.
At a lower rate.
It's going up at a rate that's sustainable, affordable and funded, as opposed to Labor's approach, which is unsustainable and unfunded. So, I, with the greatest respect to you, reject entirely the notion that it's spin. It is not spin to say we are making a change to make sure this is sustainable and affordable, and Labor's approach is unsustainable and unaffordable as a matter of fact.
Australia's pensions as a share of national income, David, are half what the typical developed country is. And this is a decision being made at the same time that the government is raising the non-concessional superannuation cap from $150,000 to $180,000.
And how
You know who that
extraordinary-
benefits?
how
That's
extraordinary-
people with probably multi-million-dollar incomes that benefit from that super concession measure, so they're giving to the top as they take from the bottom after a generation of widening inequality.
And Andrew,
deeply unfair.
how extraordinary, Andrew, that now when you want to run this line, you refer to what it is on average and as a percentage of GDP in other nations, but yet fail to mention, as you so often do when it comes to the debt debate, that the other nations to which you now refer are laboured with 70, 80, 90, 100% of debt to GDP ratios. You see, this is the fundamental point, David. Andrew's happy on the one hand to just conveniently ignore the fact that Labor's spending was unsustainable. And then they cite examples like this to try to say, oh, well, Australia's so unfair and the coalition's so unfair, but conveniently trying to sweep under the carpet the fact that the other nations that he's just referred to are actually
Have big debt
sinking in
problems.
debt.
But I think those two things go together, Steve. I mean, I think you make the point
That's
quite
right, they do.
nicely
That's
that
entirely
having
my point.
lower levels, Australia has lower levels of debt.
But no thanks to anything you do.
Precisely because we spend less on pensions.
No.
The pension problem really has hit Europe. Australia has lower levels of debt to GDP, but if you're concerned about it, you've just brought down a budget that raised the deficit. Scott Morrison said yesterday in question time very clearly, the benchmark is the pre-election economic and fiscal outlook. He's right about that. Peter Costello would agree. Relative to that, the deficit is higher this year, next year, and over the forward estimates.
Let's deal with this PFO argument, which I know is eye-glazing to a lot of viewers out there. The pre-election fiscal outlook, which Scott Morrison said yesterday, is the true figures from the officials in Treasury as to the state of the books. Is it or isn't it?
Look, the simple fact is the changes that were made under the budget reflect reasonable forecasts and the truth. So, David, the clearest example I can give, the example I often refer to, Labor in their forecasts had unemployment sitting at 6% and then miraculously overnight dropping to 5%. What we did with our forecast is said, no, it's not going to suddenly drop by 1% overnight. It's actually going to sit at, based on the forecast, then 6.25%. So when Labor talks about, as Andrew does now, to try to say, oh, but hang on, the Liberals doubled the deficit. What rubbish. We stopped with Labor's ridiculous, frankly, shifting approach where unemployment goes from 6% to 5% overnight and said, no, what? It's actually going to be in line with the forecast of 6.25%.
Well, PFO is the Secretaries of Treasury and Finance. They're not Labor numbers. They're the independent numbers brought down by two senior economic policy makers.
It comes down to assumptions.
It's the baseline. It's the baseline, and the deficit has worsened.
All right, that's PFO. Well, on that exciting note, I'd wrap things up.
You'll get viewer demand for us to come back to that topic in future episodes, I expect, David.
Andrew Leigh, Steve Ciobo, good to talk to both of you.
Thank you.
Very much.